As we get started today, don't forget that the last set of summaries is due today. If you don't get them until the end of the week, that's fine. I won't take points off. But make sure to get those in by the end of the week. And the last primary source essay is due this week as well. Thursday, we'll take some time review for the final, try to help bring some things together. And the study guide is on Blackboard, so if you want to look over that before Thursday and come with any specific questions, that would probably be helpful. I want to make sure that the time is most helpful to you as you get close to finishing up. So we come now to the period where we're kind of breaking off, right, the Reformation. And so today I want to kind of gesture toward or highlight some things that are going to be changing in this story as we move towards the Reformation. We'll actually move into that Reformation period and look at some of the cultural changes, some of the views about society. We won't spend much time at all talking about doctrine, but I will give you a brief overview of some of the major players, people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, who are very important in this period. But I do so in such a way to not suggest the radicalness of a break, but instead to suggest the idea of continuity. In many respects, it makes sense that you would make a transition between a class that ends right before the Reformation and another class that begins with the Reformation. In many respects, that's a very important transition in the history of Christianity. And in some respects, there is a very important disjunction between what happens after the Reformation and what happens before. In other ways, though, it's important to see that continuity and see how many of the things that are developing in the period that we're moving into were important for thinking about how these things connect with the past. And so that's kind of where we'll be today. And some of that is reflected in the continuing nature of the political sphere in this time period. Essentially, we are in a time period where Western Europe is broken up into a couple of different regions, loosely connected because of Catholicism. At this point, though, you have France, Spain, Italy as separate entities with respect to the Holy Roman Empire. Largely at this point, the Holy Roman Empire is mostly German. In language, not so much nationality. There is not a Germany like what we think of it today. But even the Holy Roman Empire was broken up into several different territories and regions, many of them ruled by a prince or a duke, each of whom was under the authority of the emperor. Several of those princes or dukes were also electors, so that when an emperor died, these individuals were the ones responsible for selecting a new emperor who would then have to be affirmed by the Pope. Now, by the 16th century, the period where we're getting into, it had largely turned into a dynasty, where it was assumed that the next person elected would be of the family of the previous ruler. And so we talked about the different ruling families that progressed through the latter part of the Middle Ages. But ostensibly, it was this electoral process. But as we've seen from the middle of the Middle Ages on, there is this power struggle constantly between the different sources of authority. And by this point in the history of Western Europe, the power struggles tended to be between the electorate and the empire, as princes tried to limit the emperor's power. And that's because of this setup. as the Reformation begins, it destabilizes the empire because the princes either decide to stay with Catholicism or they choose to follow the new developing Protestant version of Christianity. And so that lends itself to struggles. But it couldn't be an issue where you could eliminate all of the Protestant electors and maintain a Catholic empire because power wasn't there. And of course, there's also the connections there between the empire, these princes, and the Pope. One of the most important electors as we move into this period was a man named Frederick from the region of Saxony, often referred to as Frederick the Wise. He's important for a couple of different reasons. First, he was one of the individuals who was considered a likely successor to the Emperor Maximilian when he would die. And so as the Reformation starts, Frederick especially is a very important ruler that the Pope doesn't want to offend because of the relationship that will be there between the Emperor and the Pope. Also important in all of this is that the city of Wittenberg is in the region of Saxony. And it's where the region, specifically the city of Wittenberg, where Martin Luther will be teaching when he starts to protest some of the things of the Catholic Church. So Luther develops and works within Frederick's region. In fact, Frederick had been the person who had developed the University of Wittenberg, where Luther would eventually be employed as a professor. And although Frederick never really leaves Catholicism, he will be an important ally for Luther, providing him protection, helping him escape imprisonment, and even helping him disappear for a time when it was looking like he would end up in some serious trouble. Frederick, however, does not become the next Holy Roman Emperor. Instead, that honor is given to Charles I, the King of Spain. When Luther started questioning the Catholic Church and its doctrine and practice, the emperor was Maximilian I, who died in 1519, just a few short years after Luther began protesting. Charles I, King of Spain, who was grandson to Maximilian I, was elected to replace him. Charles was also the grandson, on his mother's side, of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And so he is connected to Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So two very important Catholic regions. And as the Reformation starts, Charles is very antagonistic to it. But he is not able to spend much time trying to eliminate Protestantism because there's all sorts of different conflict that's going on in this territory. People vying for control, the power of the electors, other regional rulers, and then Protestantism as well. And so his attention is split through a variety of different things, and so Protestantism is able to gain a foothold at various times in various places. Ultimately, Charles will abdicate the throne, and when instead of dying as ruler, and probably the struggles and tensions lended itself to that. In the East, of course, as we've noted before, the Orthodox Church was under the control of Islam. Constantinople, as we mentioned, had fallen to the Turks in 1453. The name Istanbul will eventually be used for this city, although it's not officially named. The name is not officially changed until 1928. And as we noted, there were discussions in the latter part of the 1400s into the 1500s about launching a crusade to recapture that land. But some, even in the West, believed that the Turks were actually better governors than the Byzantines had been. And that they actually thought they would be better, they were better in control than even the Pope would have been. So there isn't as much of an interest in going and moving the Turks out of this region. Additionally, a lot of the finances that could have been used to support these types of crusades are beginning to be used to support colonial expeditions in the Americas. And so instead of turning east, a lot of Western powers are looking even further west across the Atlantic. And ultimately, of course, Spain especially is one looking at the Americas for colonial expansion, and Spain especially would have been needed for any sort of crusade into the lands. Under the Turks, the church was allowed certain rights. However, Christians did face taxation in order to maintain those rights. They did find themselves conscripted into the army at various times. They were allowed to keep the Patriarch of Constantinople, but the office became a very political one, much like the bishoprics in the West ended up being for sale at various times. The Patriarchate often found itself that way as well. Essentially, the Patriarch, though, was the leader of all Christians in Turk-controlled lands. So there were some freedoms. On the other hand, there were a lot of restrictions on any sort of missionary activity, restrictions on conversion back to orthodoxy if someone had converted to Islam, for example, which could result in death. And so there were other, it wasn't total freedom. The Sultan, who was the leader of the Turks, often had a lot of control, even in the church. As we noted before, though, essentially the Orthodox center, which had been Constantinople, moved towards Russia, particularly ending in the city of Moscow, which is declared to be a third Rome by some. The rulers became emperors or czars, and the bishop of Moscow eventually became a patriarch. Which meant by the time of the dawning of the Reformation, Moscow is the only Orthodox patriarchate not under Muslim control. Right? Rome had been one of the ancient patriarchates, but is not seen that way. That's where the Pope lives. So you have Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria all under the control of Muslim rule. There was some hope for Russian help against Muslims, but there is not much unity in Russia at this time. It's mostly just a group of principalities and areas. It's not a unified country. We talked, of course, as well about the presence of some Catholic churches in these regions, the Eastern Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Catholic Rite churches. As Protestantism develops, there is a question about whether any sort of unity can be found between Orthodoxy and Protestantism. Of course, a lot of the writings Protestants are doing are either in the local languages of the people, so German or Spanish or French, or being done in Latin. So it's only gradually that some of those works are translated into Greek. Some Lutherans, though, followers of Martin Luther, feel that there might be some doctrinal agreement, especially about hierarchy, despite the ritual differences, because as Lutherans develop, they move away from some aspects of Catholic ritual. So Protestants feel that there might be an opportunity for unity with Orthodox Christians, but often the Orthodox response is, why don't you, instead of staying Protestant, become Orthodox? And there isn't this kind of let's meet halfway, it's become Orthodox. And especially pointed out where there were important disagreements. So politically, you have a variety of things going on that are both providing a foundation for Protestantism to develop and spread, as well as being shaped by the developing Protestantism. Also very important here, coming out of the Renaissance, is the continued presence of humanism. Right? This interest in the humanities, in literature, in the arts, in philosophy, particularly of the ancient Greek and Roman cultures. But it started off as kind of looking back to these people, studying the works of Aristotle, thinking about classical influences in architecture. Eventually became an impulse to look at the origins of Christianity through their original languages. Predominantly, other than a few places in monasteries, any copies of the Bible would have been the Latin Vulgate, or in the West. In the East, you still have some Greek texts, obviously. And so this interest in Greek culture, Roman culture, led people to go back to the original texts of the Christian Bible. Foremost among these thinkers was a man named Desiderius Erasmus from the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. He was an illegitimate son of a priest and grew up studying with the Brethren of the Common Life, a group of monks that we talked about was the Devotio Moderna, this modern devotion. Essentially, this group that lived like monks without the vows. Eventually, Erasmus entered into a monastery. It appears that he never really cared for dating or marriage, and so it wasn't really something he was interested in. And although his father had, when he died, left the estate to Erasmus and his brother, the guardians of the estate apparently wasted the money. And so in order to care for the children, these young boys, they were put into a monastery. And as you might expect, or as seems obvious, they resented the fact of being given over to a monastery. However, Erasmus becomes interested when he hears of the great monastery libraries in some places. And so the idea of books and study and the intellect was something that was very, very appealing to Erasmus about the monastic life. On the other hand, though, he complained about the food, he complained about the schedule, he complained about the smell of the monks. There was all sorts of things that Erasmus hated about monasticism, but the learning and the access to texts was something that he was very, very interested in. He would later be ordained a priest and become secretary to a bishop. Which allowed him to travel. He will enroll in the University of Paris, become very interested in the humanistic enterprise, and becomes very interested in traveling anywhere he can to develop more learning. He begins writing as well. One of his major works is known by the English title of the Handbook, or Dagger. There's a question as to which way to necessarily translate it. The Handbook of the Christian Soldier. Humanism and his study of the ancient text had led Erasmus to the belief that reform, which had been so important to the Brethren of Common Life, so important in monastic life, reform was to be found in a biblically literate laity. Reform was not going to occur Wow, how long ago was that? No, so the microphone cut out. There it is again. All right, looks like the microphone's still on even though the video has stopped. So the idea here that Erasmus promotes is that if the common Christian will engage in a regular reading of Scripture, will engage the literature of early Christianity, reform will come. And not only that, it was important for people to experience or practice a inner religiosity as well. And coming from that Brethren of Common Life background, where that emphasized the importance of devotion and not just empty ritual. Another one of Erasmus's important works was a document known as the Praise of Folly. Intended perhaps to be a humorous work, perhaps even a joke, underneath the humor was an attack on the corruption, ignorance, and prejudice that existed in European society at the time. There's religious corruption, there was people very interested in waging battles, lawyers were also problematic for Erasmus. All of these are the subject of his attack in places where reform was needed. Perhaps his most significant contribution, however, is not in these works, which are useful and influential, but his publication of a Greek New Testament. Now remember, the Bible is only available in Latin. We are just now at the point where the movable type printing press has been developed or is in the process of being developed. And while we might want to point the finger of providence, we can't entirely say that. Right? God moves in mysterious ways. But it seems like a lot of things are conjoining at this time in some very important ways. So based on a lot of Erasmus's beliefs, one key one was the belief that a copy of the Bible in the original languages was necessary for reform to take place. To go back to the sources, back to especially the Greek New Testament. Others will be interested in Hebrew and other languages, Aramaic, the Septuagint. But for Erasmus, the New Testament was most important. And so Erasmus goes about collecting a text from comparing manuscripts. But in the time period that he lives, the late 1400s, he does not have a lot of access to very extensive collections. In some places, only 3 or 4 manuscripts. Now this is in contrast to today where sometimes there are hundreds or thousands of manuscripts depending on the particular passage or document. In fact, when it came to the book of Revelation, he only had access to 1 Greek manuscript on Revelation. So certainly what he was able to do is nothing like what can be done today when it comes to creating a critical text of the Greek New Testament. For its time period, it is an ambitious work. However, he's not the only one engaged in it.